Hi, it's Lenny Sorensen again, and now we can learn more about the people of the enslaved community at Montpelier that provided the food for the tables uh, in the main house, and also some about the community's own foodstuffs and what they grew and ate. The laborers who were part of that complex had to transport a lot of goods. And so there were gardeners and scullions and a lot of butchery that had to go on to get the animals prepared. There was a lot of bringing in of firewood and the hauling out of ashes, uh, getting just water alone in the cooking spaces and dirty water out, garbage to be tossed somewhere, and finished foods to be transported on their fancy dishes or sometimes on platters and then reset on fancy dishes to be taken up to the table. There were, when they had large butcherings, like those shoats that, that Elsie talked about, they had to be butchered, and when they were butchered, you had all the offals, and I'll get to those in just a minute. Just think of that word for a minute. There was Alec, the Madison's principal wagoner, was his job, and throughout the 1820s and into the 1830s, Alec was sent often to and from Fredericksburg and Richmond with shipments of tobacco, which was packed in hogsheads, and then and flour that would have been raised and processed here, and wheat, whole wheat, and that had to be taken to go into the marketplace. And then those wagons would come back, and when they came back, they brought with them, in return, the sundry items that made this place a plantation, that made it the elegant plantation that it was, and included things especially for the kitchen, coffee, which usually came in beans, and people roasted it themselves, so the cooks had to know how to do that. Sugar, which came in big cones, kind of triangular cones wrapped in paper, and you had to put it in a pestle, a great big mortar and pestle, and break it apart and put it through a sieve and break it apart some more to make it fine and able to be used to make all of the incredible desserts and jams and all the uses for sugar that elite families had. He would bring home mustard, sometimes what Mary Randolph, the cookbook writer of the Virginia Housewife, called made mustard, which means mustard already made with the vinegar and other seasonings, and other times mustard seed, so that the cook would make the mustard fresh. Salad oil, which at that time sometimes was called sweet oil, and it meant olive oil. So they're eating salads. They're prepared to make dressings with salad oil and mustard and herbs and salt and pepper and other elaborate kinds of foodstuffs. They list syrup, and I think it really means when they say that things like molasses, maybe sometimes some maple syrup, because people, they would bring it down from the Northeast. It was very popular. Lemons and other citrus, because they used a lot of lemons. It was a very common flavor in desserts, and also to use with meats and sauces. And they could preserve the lemons, and often did so. There's recipes in the Virginia Housewife for how to preserve lemons in salt, how to preserve lemon juice in jars. So there would be use for that. They would bring oysters back from a place like Alexandria or Fredericksburg. Oysters would be packed. These would be oysters from the Chesapeake Bay, would be raked from the bottom of the water and then packed in wet straw, layers of wet straw and layers of oysters, so that it was quite cool. And the oysters would stay closed, and they would haul oysters, and it's one of those marvelous things. Baltimore was one of the largest transporters of oysters into the opening part of the western colonies, or the western states, Kentucky and places like that. They would haul oysters all the way there before the canning industry began to be able to preserve oysters that way. So oysters could arrive here to be opened and served at a dining table event, and we see recipes for oyster scallops and oysters on scallop shells and oyster pudding, and even an amazing thing called oyster ice cream, which is actually not sweet, but is a very savory kind of iced side dish to go with certain kinds of foods. Alec would have also brought wine that would have come in bottles by the case from abroad, whatever kind of imported wines that were coming into the household. And I'm sure there's lists of those things that we could look at and see, oh, what wine was served with what at what dinner, because these were people who were very used to eating several course meals with different wine all the way through. Then there were the spices that had to be brought in, that had to be imported, and they might come from Richmond, they might come from Fredericksburg, they might come from Washington into the United States, but of course they came from all over the world. That was part of that Atlantic world of trade where cinnamon and mace, which is the outside covering of nutmeg, and the nutmegs themselves, and black pepper, allspice, vanilla, all of those beautiful exotic spices would be brought and used within the kitchen, which meant that all of the cooks who worked at that level in the kitchen, who knew how to make those fabulous dishes, knew how to use those spices to make these elegant meals. And of course, the house mistress kept a very close eye on those very expensive items, but because of the level of expertise and the level of knowing how to pickle and how to use sugar and how to use spices, many of the cooks in elite Southern households after the emancipation were able to go into households and work as cooks, because they had this body of skill that they took with them, and thus contribute even more to the whole tradition of fine Virginia dining, because they had come out of that tradition as well. They also he would have brought things like candles and stationery. Remember, with the exception of a few kinds of lights, candles was the common kind of light. And here we know there's an order where he was sent with 50 cents to Orange Courthouse, which is the town just north, to buy 1 quart of Spanish brandy and rum. People drank a lot of spirits in the early 1800s, a lot, and they mixed them in ways that we don't do anymore. They mixed rums and wines and beers even together. They mixed wine with beaten eggs and cream, which is called syllabo. They made punches, is what they were called. And so a cook that could really make very good punch and make it consistently so that it was always delicious was really in demand, because it took real skill to know how to make these dishes that were served.